Welcome, everyone. This is Lucy Salcido-Carter with Cal Nonprofits. This is the webinar on California Venues Grant Program, the program guidelines and how to apply. And I think with that, Jan, I'm going to turn it over to you to make some opening comments.
Thanks, Lucy. Welcome, everybody. As Lucy said, this is the webinar on how to apply for the California Venues Grant. So like they announced on the plane, right? This plane is going to Denver. If you're trying to go someplace else, you need to be on a different plane. So that's today's webinar. And Lucy, who is our policy director here at the California Association of Nonprofits. So I want to welcome everybody here today. And just to let you know a word about Cal Nonprofits. We're a statewide policy alliance helping nonprofits work with government and helping government work with nonprofits. And so on the nonprofit side, we do webinars like this, helping nonprofits access government funding, but we also stand up for nonprofits in Sacramento. And for example, we were just successful in getting a bill passed that protects people on online fundraising platforms. I know all of us, have used or have benefited from like a donate now button somewhere. And there's unfortunately been kind of on the backside quite a bit of hidden abuse of those kinds of things. And so we're very happy to have been part of now protecting every single donor and every single nonprofit that makes use of those online fundraising platforms. So this program is one of those programs that in part came about because of nonprofit advocacy, particularly I think by nonprofit advocates such as Californians for the Arts, which is also on today's webinar. And so the fact is that these programs, the relief programs for nonprofits exist, and in other cases where nonprofits are allowed to apply for the same programs that small businesses have an ability to apply for, is an example of why public policy advocacy is so important. This kind of a program wouldn't even be available without that kind of advocacy behind the scenes for a very long time. And that's why I'm hoping, given the importance of policy, that you'll also consider joining our policy convention, which is coming up next week, also on Zoom, and we'll give you a little bit more information about that coming up. I did want to make sure that you understand that we at Cal Nonprofits are an application partner. We don't make the decisions about who gets grants and who doesn't. This program is sponsored by the California Office of the Small Business Advocate. So it's a California State Department program that's contracted with the financial services firm Lendistry to do the implementation of the program. So Lendistry and Cal OSBA make the decisions, not us. Our job is to coach you, helping you answer questions in the most advantaged way that you can. So there are three very important things I want you to remember through this session and going forward. The first one is we all need to get the word out to others. Okay, this program has had a very short application window, and we really all need to make sure that everybody we know who's even remotely eligible knows about it. So please, after today's webinar, just take a few minutes to think about what social media or what email addresses or your friends who are actors or anybody you know that make sure that they know that they should be applying to this program. The second thing is I want us to acknowledge that program guidance is changing and evolving. So, it's kind of like those signs that say, like something like, conditions may change or something like that. So be sure to stay in touch with us through our website. We update the FAQs all the time. Make sure that you're aware that sometimes things do change. And then thirdly, I want to make sure that we encourage everybody to apply. So this isn't one of those grant programs where like 100,000 people apply and they give awards to 3 nonprofits, right? Okay, there's thousands of nonprofits. Some have gotten grants through this program and through other programs. So it's really important. If you think that you're on the margins in the gray area, I'm not sure I'm eligible or something like that, please say, yes, I'm going to apply because it doesn't take that very much time and because you'll have a very good shot. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Sue Siegler over there. She's our expert in-house. She's, I'm sure she's one of the 10 people in the entire world who knows more about this program than anybody else. And she's also available by phone and by email. So I wanted to make sure that you all not just learn from her today, but stay connected with her. And Lucy's going to be interrupting her from time to time with questions. So if you place your questions in the Q&A box, please do that so that we can monitor your questions. And I also wanted to welcome to our today's webinar some other friends and guests. One is Patrice Ross, who is here from Lendistry, and the other is Tara Gravis White from Californians for the Arts, CFTA. So thank you very much. And I know we'll be calling on you later on to help answer some of the questions as well. Okay, so and reminder, we're going to send you these slides so you don't have to do screenshots or take frantic notes or something like that. Okay, take it away, Sue.
Thank you, Jan, and welcome everyone. Next slide, please. As Jan mentioned, today we're going to be talking about applications for the California Venues Grant Program. And the program is open to both nonprofits and businesses. Today we'll be focusing on nonprofits applying to the program. But if you're here from a for-profit business, we encourage you to stay with us because there'll be a lot of good information for you too. Once again, don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A box. And there's a lot of information about this program. That's why we've got this website up on the screen, cavenusgrant.com. If you visit there, you can find free webinars almost every day of the week. You can find an application guide. You can find the eligibility guidelines posted right on the home page. And so today we're going to hit as many of the highlights as we can, but do want to note that there is even more information available at cavenusgrant.com. As Jan mentioned, guidance continues to be updated, and so we try to keep everybody apprised of that. Please do check back to our website frequently. And we'll note also that this program is intended to support established venues. And what that means is you don't have to own or lease your own venue, or maybe you do. Those can both be qualifying factors, but it is not intended for new or startup programs. So if you're looking for information about funding to begin a new venue, this probably would not be the program for you. And this webinar is also not for general fundraising information. We are only going to be talking about the CA Venues Grant Program. I'll note also that the cavenusgrant.com website is also where you go when you're ready to begin your application. Next slide, please. And here's a screenshot from our website. When you land on calnonprofits.org, you'll see this box on the right, and you can click on that white box for more information on the program. You can also find my contact information, which we'll be posting later on in the webinar. And you can also view recorded webinars there and on our YouTube channel for Cal Nonprofits. I want to mention that this application is different from other applications that nonprofits might fill out, and particularly in the respect that there is no narrative. So that makes it a little faster to be able to get through the application, which is filled out completely online. And let's see. And once you go to start your application at cavenusgrant.com, we hope that you'll note that Cal Nonprofits is your referring partner when asked on the application. Next slide, please. A quick disclaimer that there are, unfortunately, fraudsters and scammers out there. So we want you to know that applying for this grant is completely free. If anybody asks you to pay for anything in order to apply for the grant, that is a scam, and please don't interact with them. Communications throughout the process of your application will come from lendistry.com. And Lendistry's website, once again, is cavenusgrant.com. Do not provide information to anybody who asks you to provide it anyway, but returning to your application and continuing to fill it out. Be sure to watch your inbox also, and also your junk mail and your spam filter for communications from lendistry.com, because Lendistry does communicate with you to confirm things like your application has been received, and also during processing if they have any questions and need to contact you. Next slide, please. We're going to start talking about who is eligible for the program and go over some of those basic eligibility guidelines. We want to note that this program is a program of the state of California. Many people with us today may have applied for and or received funding from federal programs like SVOG, or the Shuttered Venues Operators Grant, which was specifically for venues as well. And you may have received funding from the Federal Payroll Protection Program, or PPP, or EIDL. And you may have received funding from the California Relief Grant Program, which is another state program. We want to mention that the California Venues Program is separate and distinct from all those other programs. Even if you got SVOG funding, we encourage you to approach this program completely differently. The assumptions that you might have made for SVOG may not apply for the California Venues Grant Program. We've been asked how this program compares to SVOG. There are differences, but we don't have an analysis of that available at this time. And many people will have questions about, even after we go through the eligibility criteria, about whether their venue fits into the criteria. Remember that you can always go back and review that at cavenuesgrant.com. And if you have any questions, you can contact me by email or phone, and we'll have my contact information up in a little bit. With respect to nonprofit organizations, remember that you have to be a 501c3 in order to qualify for this grant. That differs from the California Relief Grant, where some of the other 501c designations could qualify. But for this program, it is a 501c3. If you're a for-profit business, you can be a sole proprietor, C or S Corp, an LLC, a partnership, etc. One of the basic criteria is that you have to have been operating in the state of California prior to June 1st, 2019. And you have to have been impacted by COVID, because this is a COVID relief program. Impacts of COVID might be business interruptions or even total shutdowns as a result of the pandemic. We're also going to go over what the required documents are that you need to submit, and all of the documents will be required in order to make a complete application. Next slide, please. So here are those aforementioned required documents. You'll need to be able to provide state and federal tax returns for your tax year, 2019 and 2020. Now, we know that there are a number of nonprofit organizations whose fiscal years mean that they may not have yet filed their state and federal taxes for 2020. Don't let that keep you from applying. Lendistry has updated their guidance on that. If you don't have your 2020 taxes completed and available, when you get to that part of the application where you're uploading documents, type a little note that says your 2020 taxes are not yet available. Save it in a PDF format and upload that where your tax documents would go. If you can give Lendistry the information about when you expect to have those available, that's a good thing to include too. And then Lendistry will be doing a lot of verification that your organization is in good standing, both with the state of California and the federal government. And so they'll be looking for a copy of your filing with the Secretary of State. That might include one of the following: your articles of incorporation, a certificate of organization, fictitious name registration, or a government issued business license. You'll also be asked to provide a copy of the driver's license or passport for the applicant. And I'll note that all of your documents need to be submitted in PDF format. The only exception to that is the copy of your driver's license or passport, which could also be submitted in a JPEG format. Let's note for a moment that some nonprofit organizations who fall under $50,000 a year in annual revenue may not be required to file a state informational return for your tax year. If that's the case, once again, please follow that advice to type out a little note that you're not required to do that. Save it as a PDF and upload it to your application where you would put that document if you had it. Next slide, please. And now we're welcoming Tara Gravis from Californians from the Arts, who is going to review with us what these codes up on the screen mean for your eligibility.
Thank you, Sue. So for this California Venues Grant Program, the legislature has deemed these 5 Nasus codes eligible for the grant application. They are aware, Lendustry is aware, we are aware that some of you might have chosen a different Nasus code for your tax returns or for other grant applications. That's not a problem. As long as you can comfortably fit within one of these Nasus codes, these are the Nasus codes you'll want to select from. They are available on the drop-down menu of the application. And as you go through your application, you'll see them there. And as long as you feel good about that, go ahead and move forward and select one of these applications, as again, these are the only ones approved to move forward with your application.
Thank you very much. And I want to underscore what Tara said, which is if you might have used a different Nasus code in the past, please, but you can fit under one of these, please go ahead and use one of the 5 codes. Lendustry understands that sometimes nonprofits can reasonably fall under more than one Nasus code. And again, we want to underscore that if you feel like you're at all close to meeting the eligibility for this program, please do go ahead and apply. Next slide, please. Continuing on with eligibility, the organization also has to be able to meet the following criteria. And here's where we get into defining the types of venues that are available. And before I talk a little bit about that, I want to make sure that I'm emphasizing with folks that I hear from many nonprofits who have different programs in the arts or theater, et cetera. And they're wonderful programs. And this grant opportunity is not conceived of as an opportunity to support programming. It is an opportunity to support the venue and to keep that venue going, whether it has a permanent physical location or not. So please bear that in mind as we talk about these eligibility criteria. The most important one is that the principal business activity for the applicant has to be in organizing, promoting, producing, managing, or hosting live events like concerts, comedy shows, theatrical productions, other performing artist events. And those events have to take place at an eligible venue where a cover charge or tickets are sold either in advance or at the front door, and the performers are paid. So I know I get a lot of questions from, say, maybe community theaters where all of the performers are volunteers. Please do note that there is a requirement that performers be paid. If you have a mixed cast of paid and volunteer performers, please do go ahead and apply. The next eligibility criteria is that 70% of the applicant's earned income, and we're going to talk about how they're defining earned income in just a moment, but 75% of that earned income has to be generated through either cover charges or ticket sales, production and promotion fees, or the sale of event beverages, food, or merchandise. Now, in nonprofit organizations, we typically include a number of other things in our earned revenue calculations. That might include interest income on bank accounts. It might include sponsorships, or it might include, if your organization also teaches classes, it might include tuition fees. It's important to remember that only those 4 things listed in bold there count as earned income for the purposes of this grant. Again, cover charges or ticket sales, production and promotion fees, and the sale of event beverages, food, and merchandise. Then the last criteria on this slide states that the organization has to demonstrate that there was an earned revenue decline of at least 70% in 2020 over 2019. This is how industry will evaluate the impact of COVID on your venue. So they are looking to see that that in 2020 you had a decline of at least 70% in your earned revenue as defined above over 2019. And let me say also that applications will be prioritized. You have to show at least a 70% decline. If you have a greater decline, then you'll receive a greater priority in terms of eligibility for the grant. So industry will prioritize by the greatest revenue decline and provide grants, prioritize grants in that way. I'll also note that if you are an organization that has operations in more than one state, then at least 75% of your earned revenue has to be generated in California in order to be able to qualify for the grant. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about additional eligibility requirements specific to venues. So for the purposes of this grant, an eligible venue is defined as a defined performance and audience space, which includes mixing equipment, a PA system, and a lighting rig. Again, you don't have to own or have a long-term lease on that space, but the point being that that's where you provide the events that you do. I'll note that if you applied for SVOG, that there were a lot of specifics about what that lighting rig needed to encompass. That is not part of this grant. It merely says that you need a lighting rig. Additionally, you have to employ 2 or more of the following personnel during your events. That would be a sound engineer, a booker, a promoter, a stage manager, security personnel, and a box office manager. You don't have to have every one of those positions, just 2 or more. And for nonprofits who might be providing free events, the events must be produced and managed primarily by paid staff and cannot be all volunteer. So it doesn't say you can't have any volunteers doing any of your functions, but the guidelines do say primarily produced by paid staff. Next slide, please. Continuing on with the eligible live event criteria, we're talking about tickets must be made available for purchase by the public at least 30 days before the event. Performers are paid on a standard kind of rate. We talked about at least 70% of the earned revenue of the applicant is generated through those categories of cover charges or ticket sales, production and promotion fees, and sales of food, beverage, or merchandise. And the individual applicant cannot be a major league or professional sports team or a minor league team that is owned by a major league team. However, lots of other teams charge for folks to view their games, and as long as it's not defined as a major league team or owned by a major league team, those entities can qualify as well. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what types of entities the guidelines specifically exclude. Next slide, please. For-profit businesses, they cannot be publicly traded corporations or majority owned by a publicly traded corporation. The entity cannot operate in more than 5 states or another country, and it can't be owned by an entity that operates in more than 5 states or another country. This slide says generates less than 75% of its gross earned income in California, and we talked about that that's flipping it around, what we talked about earlier, that the requirements say that you have to earn at least 75% of your earned revenue in California. Businesses need to have a physical presence in the state and to be headquartered in the state. Industry will look to your tax filings and the addresses that are listed on there to determine where you are headquartered. Government entities other than Native American tribes or elected official offices are not eligible for the funding, nor are businesses primarily engaged in lobbying activities or businesses who file a Schedule E on their tax returns. And now I want to continue to ask everybody to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we're going to turn to Lucy to see what's been coming in.
Okay, great, Sue. Yes, we have some questions from movie theaters, and they're wondering if this only qualifies for venues that do live events, or do movie theaters qualify?
This this program is particularly directed toward businesses and nonprofits that do provide live events. I'm aware that many venues might host movies at times and live events at others, so we'd encourage those organizations and businesses to apply. But if you are strictly a movie theater, you're unlikely to qualify.
Okay, so if it is a theater that shows movies but also does live events, you're encouraging folks to apply. But if it's just films, then they aren't eligible.
That's correct.
Okay. And then can you just go over again the paid staff versus paid performers eligibility requirements? There's a lot of confusion about that.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. And then
I'd encourage folks also to take a look again at the CA Venues Grant website. My slides are lifted right off of there, and there is more explanation. There's also a very detailed application guide that goes through some of these factors. But what the regulations are saying is that performers need to be paid. And then also the staff who are managing the performances primarily need to be paid. It doesn't mean that you can't have any volunteers involved, but remember, this is not a general support program for nonprofit venues. It is to help those that were impacted by COVID.
Okay, great. And then just some details about that. If staff wear multiple hats but still fit within that list of categories that you included, is that okay?
I would say go ahead and apply, absolutely.
Okay. And what about a stipend for performers and technicians?
Go ahead and apply.
Okay. And then we have a question about venues that host weddings and church services.
Again, those are not generally events that one would sell tickets or charge a cover charge for. So the guidelines don't say that you can't ever do that in your venue, but if that is, remember that phrase about a primary business activity. So Industry is going to look at what is your primary business activity. If you were, say, a venue that maybe rented out your church or rented out your venue for church services once a week, and the rest of the time we're hosting events that are ticketed, go ahead and apply. But if it was the other way around, if you're a church who once in a while rents out your venue for other types of events, your primary business activity would not be for live events that are open to the public, and that would not be a qualifying venue.
Okay. And if you are an arts organization that produces live events but does not own your own venue, are you eligible?
Once again, it is not required that you own your own venue, nor that you could be an arts organization that produces events at multiple venues. That's okay. You don't need to own it, and you don't have to have it on a long-term lease.
Okay. And then organizations for whom live performance is not their primary business are essentially not eligible. I know that was a lot of negatives.
So I think that's probably referring to some of those organizations that we see who might have education as their primary business activity or training of some kind. And again, the primary business activity needs to be in those live events.
Okay, great. I think that is good for now around eligibility, and I know we'll have a lot of chances to ask more questions later.
Thank you, Lucy. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about what are the eligible uses of funds under the grant. And so the eligible uses of funds are for things like employee salaries and benefit, overhead and occupancy expenses. That might be things like rent or mortgage or utilities, insurance. If the venue has been closed, any reopening costs, or any COVID-related costs not covered by other programs or grants. Some examples of those might be if you had to install plexiglass at your snack bar or ticket office, if you're providing hand sanitizer or face masks to people in attendance. Those are some examples of COVID-related costs. Might even be if you had to switch your events to live online and needed to purchase a super duper Zoom account in order to be able to continue. Those are that's another example of a COVID related cost. I'll note that we said that rent and mortgages are eligible uses of funds. And in the case of mortgages, that mortgage had to be in place prior to March 1st, 2020. New mortgages are not an eligible use of funds under this grant program. And I frequently get the question about what is the time frame in which we have to spend down these funds? And the answer is we don't have any guidance on that. The only guidance that we have is to retain your records for 3 years, which most people are doing anyway. And but we do know that it's not required that if you've closed your prior fiscal year, you don't need to go back and reopen your books and match up expenses and grant funds. That is not required. As long as you are spending the funds among the eligible use categories, that's okay. And you'll note that on the application, it's going to ask you what you want to spend your funds on and give you a drop-down menu with some choices. The grantors know that you have to choose one, but you might be spending funds on multiple categories of eligible expenses. And that's okay. Or let's say you get the grant and then you decide, well, I got another grant that covered my employee salaries, but I'd like to put this toward rent and insurance. That's okay. Next slide, please. We're going to come back to, again, some of the required documents in a little more detail here. You'll be required to supply what's called an application certification, which is basically where you'll attest to the information that you've provided in your application is true and correct. And you can obtain the application certification as a download from the CA Venues Grant website. I'll note there are 2 application certifications available, so you'll want to choose the one that's appropriate to you, either small business or the nonprofit version. Again, we've talked about the federal and state tax returns for 2019 and 2020, all pages. And if 2020 isn't available for you yet, type out a little note, save it as a PDF, and upload it in the section where you would have put your 2020 taxes. The driver's license or passport in a PDF or JPEG format. And you'll be asked also for financial statements for quarters 2, 3, and 4 in 2019 and 2020. This causes a lot of confusion for those of us who are not on a calendar fiscal year. So when you're asked to provide 2019 and 2020 data for those 3 quarters, it is for the calendar year. That is how Lendistry will establish that you were impacted by COVID, by comparing those 3 quarters in 2019 and those 3 quarters in 2020. Again, one of the following documents that establishes you are in good standing in the state of California. Nonprofits also need to include their IRS tax exempt letter and the California Secretary of State filing showing that you were in business prior to June 1, 2019. I want to stop here for a moment and talk about who should be named as the applicant when you're filling out your nonprofit application. If you're if you're a business owner, the application is going to ask you who is the owner of this organization, and that would be clear. But for nonprofits, we know we don't have owners, and Lendistry knows that too. So you're going to name someone as the applicant for your organization, and that person's name has to appear, on the statement of information filing that you have on file with the California Secretary of State's office. If you're familiar with that document, you'll know that it lists 3 principles of your organization. The applicant must be one of those 3 people. The statement of information will also list your agent for service, and the applicant cannot only be listed as the agent for service. They can also be listed as the agent for service and one of the principals. But again, the applicant has to be one of those 3 listed principles on your statement of information on file with the California Secretary of State. Let's note also that when you're providing your documents, the maximum document size is 15 megabytes. If you have a document that is larger than 15 megabytes, you have two choices. You can either compress it if you know how to do that, or you can separate it into two documents and label them appropriately. So for example, 2019-990 Part 1 and 2019-990 Part 2. I want to also note that you have the opportunity to provide documents even after the deadline for the program application, which is November 19th at 5 p.m. And we encourage everybody who thinks that they might want to apply to please go ahead and begin your application prior to November 19th at 5 p.m. You will need to provide a completed application in order for Lendistry to be able to process and evaluate your application. But if you're missing a document and waiting and you think you're going to get it soon, go ahead and fill out that application because you can return and upload documents after the deadline. You'll notice as you move through the application also that every field needs to have an answer in it. But you don't need to complete the application all at one time. You can hit save and return later, log back into your application and finish it later on. And once you have everything uploaded and there needs to be a document in every category, there needs to be every field filled out in the online application. After that happens, then you'll see submit. And when you're able to click submit, you'll know that you have filed a complete application. We encourage everybody to file complete applications as soon as you're able to, so that Lendistry can process your application more rapidly. Next slide, please. I want to linger a moment also on the financial data that you'll be asked for. People get confused on this quite a bit. And our tip on this is to make a little spreadsheet and upload it with your financial statements where you're asked for that. And you're going to be asked for data for 2019 and 2020. You'll be asked for what is your gross revenue. Please note that that has to match what you're showing on your tax return as your gross revenue. And then you'll be asked for your earned revenue. And then you'll be asked for the earned revenue in those 3 quarters from both 2019 and 2020. Remember that earned revenue is only, for purposes of this grant, is only defined as ticket sales or cover charges, production and promotion fees, and the sale of food, beverage, and merchandise. Next slide, please. And of course, we have to talk about what is the maximum grant amount that you'll be eligible for. It will be 20% of your earned revenue in California in 2019, with a maximum of $250,000. So Lendistry is going to look at what was your earned revenue in 2019 in California, and 20% of that, if it's over 250,000, you can receive a maximum of 250,000. For those who might have received a California relief grant, because these are 2 state programs, any amount that you receive from the California relief grant will be deducted from your California Venues Grant Award. Next slide, please. We have a bunch more application tips for you. So on the application, please note that when you're asked to give an address, don't use a PO box. Lendistry needs to verify that there is a physical location associated with your nonprofit or your business. For those of you who applied for the California Relief Grant Program, you know which email address you provided on which application was an issue. This is a completely separate program, and you can use the same email address as you used on your relief grant application. Please use a standard email address. By that, I mean the name or the identifier at, and then the domain. Please don't use things like no reply or info at or at contact.com. Those things will be filtered out by the system and labeled as spam. We talked about the owner and the applicant are used interchangeably. And I want to speak for a moment on the applicant's personal data. Whoever is named as the applicant will need to give their date of birth and social security number. What Lendistry will do with that is they will do what's called a soft credit check. They are not actually going to be checking the applicant's credit, and it will not impact the applicant's credit score. It is used to verify identity, and Lendistry is using vigorous fraud prevention measures and vigorous methods to make sure that they can verify the applicant's identity. Unfortunately, you won't be given an opportunity to print out or save a copy of your application. So if you'd like to save your work, please take a screenshot of each of the pages that you fill out. And again, begin that application by November 19th at 5 p.m. And this is very important. Make sure that whenever you are accessing the application, that you are working in Google Chrome as your browser. The application will tend to freeze or return errors if you're trying to work in other browsers like Internet Explorer or Firefox. And there are other tech tips in the application guide at cavenuesgrant.com that's very worth taking a look through before you go ahead and if you're having any problems with the application and before you begin working on the application. And once you have clicked submit on your application, you cannot go back and make changes. So if you need to do that, then you have to contact the Lendistry call center, and their phone number is at the bottom of the CA Venue Grants website. They're open Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And after you've submitted your application or after you've started your application, please make sure that you're being alert for communications from anyone at lendistry.com. Again, monitor your junk mail and your spam filter. I'll also note that there will be questions about how many jobs you've retained and created in your application. Please use figures as of 12/31/2020 when answering that. There'll be some drop-down menus that particularly nonprofits may not fit neatly into the categories. It's okay to choose unknown if that's the best answer for you. It will not impact your eligibility, or choose whatever is closest to you so that you can continue to move through and complete the application. There'll also be questions about demographics, like is this a women-owned business or other demographics questions. You can either answer that for the person who's named as the applicant or for the majority of your board and leadership team. Please don't provide taxes in a file in a format that is password protected. Or if you do, please provide the password along with it so that Lendistry can take a look at the tax documents that you have submitted. And let's see, let's move on now to the next slide and talk about what happens after you have submitted your application. So once you begin interacting with the application online, when you first go to start your application, you'll be asked to create an account. It will generate an email to you from Lendistry to you with your password that you can use anytime that you want to return and complete or view your application. Don't forget to upload all of your documents or something in that category that indicates why the document is not there. When Lendistry is reviewing your application, if they have questions or need additional documentation, they will contact you. Note that you can monitor your application status by logging back into your application anytime you like. So please remember to save the link that you're using when you're filling out your application. And you'll know that you're moving through the system by returning and checking out your application status by logging back in. And also, you'll know that you're going to be approved for funding because you will receive a grant agreement from DocuSign in your email box. So watch for that. Once you've signed your grant agreement, then you are on your way to receiving your funding. But there is one other step. You'll need to link your bank account. The application will ask for your bank account login credentials, including your password. And this is required. Lendistry does not provide paper checks or wire transfers. It is handled in secure transaction by a company called Plaid. And so I get a lot of questions about, do I actually need to link my bank account? And the answer is yes. And now we're going to turn to Lucy again and say, Lucy, what other questions do we have in the Q&A box? Next slide, please.
Okay, we have a few questions about gross earned revenue. One is unrealized, are unrealized gains and losses on investments included in gross earned revenue?
I am going to say that I don't know the answer to that question. And we have some other experts on the call with us today. I wonder if any of our industry reps or Tara might know the answer to that question.
So I saw that question in the chat box, and I am not sure. I will get a confirmed answer on that, though.
Thank you. That's Patrice. Thank you, Patrice. I will say, remember that when you're talking about earned revenue for the purposes of this grant, you're only talking about ticket or cover charge revenue, production or promotion fees, and sales of food, beverage, and merchandise. So if we're talking about earned revenue, those are the only categories that count for the purposes of this grant.
Unrealized gains don't show up on your income statement on your 990 form, so they're not considered part of revenue until you realize them. It's like, for example, if you own property and the price of that property goes up, but you haven't sold it, you haven't really gained anything since you still have that piece of property, so that doesn't count as revenue.
Thank you, Jan.
Okay. And then we have some confusion around question 10 that asks if your gross earned revenue loss is greater than 70%. And then the following two questions ask for gross annual revenue. Can you just clarify that, please?
Yes. So remember that in order to qualify for the grant, I know that these questions get confusing in part because I think one of them is asked in a double negative. So if your loss of earned revenue was greater than 70%, then you qualify. So when you see that question, you'll answer yes. And I think one of the other sources of confusion is that the application will talk about gross revenue and it will talk about gross earned revenue. Gross earned revenue is not really a term in nonprofit accounting. So drop the gross there and just look at earned revenue. And remember, it's by that definition that we just talked about several times. So it will be asked for your gross revenue. That should be from your tax year. It should match whatever is on your 990. And then don't get confused when it says gross earned revenue. Just drop that gross and think about earned revenue according to the definition.
And you mentioned that if nonprofits have received a grant from the Small Business Relief Grant Program, that amount would be deducted from the award. Do they need to do anything in the application process to deduct that amount when they're applying?
No, you don't.
Well, that just happened. Okay.
No, you don't. That will just happen.
Okay. And then we need a little more clarification around fiscal years, because I think that's a bit confusing for folks who have different fiscal years from the calendar year. We have one person who's saying that their tax return for 2019 reflects the decline in revenues due to COVID, but the comparison of 2019 and 2020 won't really show a normal pre-COVID revenue picture. So should they use their calendar 2019 versus calendar 2020 to reflect the appropriate decline in revenue?
You will see in the application, it is indicated very clearly where your gross revenue reporting must match your tax return. And then when you go to do that calculation of the earned revenue for the 3 quarters, those are calendar quarters. So don't get hung up on what your fiscal year is. Or if you feel like the numbers that you're presenting don't really reflect the impact on your organization, type up a very brief note and include it with one of your documents.
Okay. And then we have a clarifying question about which forms to use to show the Q2, Q3, Q4. Is that a profit and loss statement? And then they mentioned the 941, which I believe has to do with payroll So which documents should they use for
You
that?
don't need to, you're not going to need to provide any of those documents. You're going to add together your earned revenue according to the definition for Q2, 3, and 4, and provide that where it's asked for. And remember, that's a calendar quarter, not your fiscal year quarter, when they're asking for your earned revenue.
Great. And then it is also true that receipts are not necessary to show revenue.
That is correct. You do not need to provide documentation like that.
Okay. And then just once again, could you clarify about when a nonprofit rents out a venue to other production companies? Is that considered earned revenue for eligibility purposes?
I believe so. I'm going to turn to Tara or Patrice and ask if anybody has a different answer to that. Hearing none, we'll leave that stand.
Okay. And then a sort of a variation on that question is, what if the leases started after the March 1, 2020? Even though the organization has been in existence, can they still, can they still?
The March 1, 2020 date, the March 1, 2020 date only applies to mortgages, not to leases.
Okay. All right. And then can you just go over any reporting requirements again for people?
Sure. The guidance is silent, so we don't know about reporting requirements. And so the advice that we have for folks is to please retain your records for at least 3 years.
Okay. And then is there any documentation required to show that performers and staff are being paid?
Not for the initial application. If Lendistry has questions about that kind of thing, they will contact you when they're reviewing the application.
Okay. And the remaining questions are very specific to particular kinds of organizations around eligibility. It sounds like there's information that people can access to look again at the eligibility requirements. Can you just go over that a little bit generally, Sue?
Sure. If you go to the cavenuesgrant.com website, you will see the eligibility criteria detailed right on the homepage. And then also you can click on the application guide, which will give you even more information about eligibility criteria, how to fill out the application, and and then also if you have even more questions, there's an FAQ, frequently asked questions, on that website as well.
Okay, good. That's it for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Lucy. And Jan, we'll turn it back over to you to take us out.
Wow, that went by fast. The data stream going by very quickly. So thanks very much, Sue. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Tara and Patrice, for helping to answer so many questions for so many different people. And we hope everybody here on today's webinar gets a grant. Wouldn't that be great? That'd be like a lot of fun for us to do. I would just want to thank everybody again. Our speakers today, Lucy Salcido-Carter, Cal Nonprofits Policy Director, Sue Siegler, world expert on Cal Venues program, Tara Gravis-White from CFTA, and Patrice Ross from Lendistry. And I also want to thank our off-camera team, Henry Twong and Christine Metropolis of Cal Nonprofits, and Steve Heller, who's our closed captioner today. I myself am a person who is hard of hearing, so I really appreciate the fact that we always have closed captions available for people like me who appreciate that. And again, we'll also be sending you the slides so you don't have to worry if there was something that you missed. Just want to remind you that today's webinar was able to be free, partly because of the sponsorship of Lendistry and Cal OSBA, but also partly because our 10,000 members help make it possible for us to offer things like this at no cost. So I hope you'll consider joining Cal Nonprofits, and I hope you'll also consider coming to our policy convention next week. So for example, one of the sessions that I've been working on finalizing today is one on raising compensation in nonprofit organizations, looking at it from a public policy angle rather than from a management angle. So hope you'll do that. that, we'll get to hear from our Attorney General, the state official who's kind of in charge of nonprofits and philanthropy. So that should be cool as well. So thanks, everybody. Thanks. Good luck to everybody and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody. Bye.